Well, look, the mother and baby homes were big news again this week as the Dáil debated a new commission of investigation. Most attention focused on the Labour TD Anne Ferris, who risked expulsion from her party by defying the party whip and not voting with the government on proposed amendments. Her controversial stance is informed by deeply personal experiences about which she has spoken in the Dáil before.
Minister, 2 weeks ago I met my younger sister for tea across the road in the Miriam Hotel. Before that day, 2 weeks ago, I had never laid eyes on my sister. Each of us was adopted from a different mother and baby home, into different families, eventually ending up living in different countries. I never played childhood games with a sister. I never fought with her over toys. We never skipped together or climbed trees. She wasn't handed down my old clothes. We didn't go to school together or to discos or fight over boys. She doesn't know my children and I've never met hers. We look very alike, but so far that's the only aspect of our lives that we share.
Well, Anne Ferris, Labour TD, is with me this morning. But Anne, you're not alone in Leinster House in being adopted. And this morning we've invited two other prominent legislators to join us who are also adopted and who, as babies, spend time in mother and baby homes. Averil Power is a Fianna Fáil senator and Joan Burton is Taoiseach and Minister for Protection. You're all really welcome here this morning. And just to say, we're putting politics to one side this morning. We're putting your political differences aside too. And we're just going to talk about your personal experiences of adoption and the impact it's had in your lives. Firstly, happy birthday, Taoiseach.
Thank you.
Anne, take us back. Just tell us a little bit about your own personal story.
Thank you, Miriam. I think mine is a bit complicated insofar as that I became pregnant as a teenager, foolishly. And it was when I was pregnant that I was told that I myself had been adopted. Now, I understand that I had been told this as a very young child, but it went in one ear and out the other. And but it was a terrible shock to me. I mean, obviously it was a shock being pregnant at 16, but then it was a shock to think and to realise that the family that I had grown up with, my sisters and brothers and parents, were not who I always thought they were. And so, you know, I had to come to terms with two things. My own daughter was born and she was adopted. So I had the loss of my daughter, my baby, and also trying to come to terms with the family that I had grown up with. And because, you know, I became quite bitter in a way, and wrongly so, because I had, you know, you couldn't find a more loving family to be reared in, and they were all always great to me, and subsequently. But then, like what you say in the clip there, I didn't realise until last year that I had a younger sister. She's 5 years younger, so that was another story in my life. So it's quite complicated. It's not just that I was adopted and that was it, because that, I think, for people to deal with, in a sense, is it's huge in itself. And I think I just want to say that for Luca's song there, I think the lyrics in the song, the words in it, when he's saying about coming out of the darkness and shining a light, I think that's what we're trying to do all the time, to be the voice for the people who can't tell their story.
And Joan, your story of adoption.
Well, today is my birthday, and obviously I'm not called Bridget. My first name was Josephine, but I was adopted. My adopted mother was Bridget Bridie, and actually, were she still alive, her birthday would have been yesterday. So this time of the year has always been special to me, and I want to thank Luca for the song, because St. Bridget, as a very powerful woman in Irish history, the notion of St. Bridget's cloak, we were certainly taught that over and over again in school. And I always knew I was adopted. I can't remember not knowing that I was adopted, because I was born on a farm in South Carlow, and when I was a couple of months old, I went to Temple Hill in Blackrock, where I was then in foster care and in Temple Hill for another 2 years plus. And when I was about 2.5, I went to the Burton. So I'm different to quite a lot of other adopted people who were adopted very young as a baby and perhaps don't have, the memories or also the knowledge always that they were adopted. I always had that. And I came to Dublin to Rialto Cottages. I still remember the number 73. It was a one-bedroomed artisan's little house, and I thought it was heaven. And I started school then with the nuns in the Loretto on the Crumlin Road, and in fact I met a couple of them a few nights ago. They were in with a friend of mine, Mary Upton, actually having some food in the Dáil. I then moved to the north side to Oxmantown Road, where then I went to school with the Sisters of Charity, who had arranged my adoption. So they've been a kind of constant theme in my life. And you know, there are a lot of people who were adopted, about 50,000 people, once adoption law was introduced in 1952 in Ireland. So there are an awful lot of us. We all have original birth families, we all have adopted families, and we have our own families. So, you know, what's so important, as Anne was saying about Luca's song, is the light. It was kind of an open secret in Ireland that so many babies were given up for adoption and found new families. And really, there's been, in 1992, I remember, people came back from America to look for their details. But I got married in 1975, and like a lot of adopted people, what I wanted, I suppose, on and off, was to know. So I wrote to the adoption agency, St. Patrick's Guild, asking them if my mother was alive, if they knew where she was, my birth mother, would they send a letter, my letter, to her to say I'd grown up, I was doing this, that and the other, and I was getting married. And I always remember I got the letter back, carefully resealed, just saying, no way. And I think that's the difficulty that there was for a lot of people. It's just normal curiosity and finding out.
And we'll come back to more details as well from both Anne and Joan. Averil, your story about being adopted.
Well, I think I was about 9 or 10 when my parents first told me that I was adopted. Like Anne, I think it was a big shock. It just never occurs to you as a child that the family that you brought, that you're growing up in, might not be your biological family. So it was a big shock. Then I guess the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I'm very, very dear. I don't look anything like my parents or my brothers, my sister that I grew up with. We look very different. We have really different personalities. That probably even before they told me, I always felt like a bit of an oddity for that reason in the family. So it made sense when I thought about it. And then I guess as I got older, I mean, my adoptive parents, they're still my parents, they're still my family, and that relationship was still there. But as I got older, I needed to know more about my biological mum. Just normal questions that people wonder. I mean, everyone else is able to take for granted, knowing where they get their personality from or their looks. Things like medical history, every time you go to a doctor and somebody asks you if there's serious illness in the family or anything like that, and you don't know. And I used to get particularly sad on my birthday and at Christmas and family times. I'd be thinking, where is my mum? Is she okay? How have things turned out for her? Do I have brothers and sisters? There was this huge part of me that as I got older, I just felt like there was this huge and a hole in my life and this huge gap. Like there was a huge part of myself that I knew nothing about. So when I turned 18, I rang the adoption board pretty much on my 18th birthday or a few days afterwards. I'm in the naive assumption that they tell me. I thought, I'm an adult now, I'm entitled to this information. So I picked up the phone and I rang them, and they said, well, thanks for your call and we'll log that, but there's not a whole lot we can do for you. They told me the name of the adoption agency. They said, look, you can register with the agency, tell them that you'd like to find your mother, and if she ever gets in contact, then we'll let you know. But that was it. And so from then on, I guess, still kind of had that just big gap in my life, that sadness. I always wanted to find my mum. I didn't have maybe the strength to do it when I was in college, and that to find the strength to go off and do a search and do a private search. I wouldn't even know where to start. But then I think it was around 2005, 2006, there was a national contact register set up for adopted people, a form. I remember the form coming through the door in the flat that I was living in at the time, and it said there's a register that's been set up. If you're adopted, you can put your name on it. If adopted parents can put their name on it, and if you match, then you'll be put in contact with each other. Signed up. I suppose I didn't want to get my hopes up. I said to myself, well, look, maybe nothing will come of this, but you should do it anyway. And then a few months later, a letter came through in the post, and it said, your mum wants to get in touch with you. and it was the most incredible piece of post that you can get in your life. It was a letter that came through from Barnados, who were the mediation agency that were dealing with the register for people who were born, and I was adopted from Temple Hill, like Joan. And then after that, myself and my mum started to exchange letters and photographs, things like that. It was, if the first letter was emotional, to just find out that she wanted to get in touch with me, to finally see a picture of your mum after nearly 30 years of my life, to finally get a photo of this woman who was a mirror image of me, just 20 years older. Letters talking about herself, filled in a lot of gaps for me, because there's a debate about nature and nurture and what you do and don't get from your parents. But when my mum wrote to me and said that after she had me, and then I have 2 half sisters and a half brother, after she reared them, she went back to college. She studied social policy. She studied politics. She's very, very similar interest to me, which is just, maybe there's nothing in that. Maybe there's coincidence, but I don't think so. She works in a similar line of work to me, and we're very, very similar. And it was incredible to finally find that out, and then to get to meet her. So we met then eventually through Barnados. Barnados run a counselling service where they act as an intermediary first for passing letters back and forth, and then they help you to actually meet. So went in one morning in August 2007 into Barnados. I went into a room with the counsellor who was handling our case, talked to her for a few minutes, and she said, "Okay, Averil, I'm going to go get Mary, bring in your mum." So Christine, the counsellor, went out for a few minutes, walked back in, brought in my mum. We just looked at each other, we hugged, we cried. It's hard even to know what to say when you're finally in the same room after so long. And luckily for me, it's worked out really well since then. We keep in touch. I now know my 2 half sisters, my half brother, my aunts, uncles, my granny, my whole second family of this huge extended second family, and it's worked out really well for me. And I suppose I finally feel like I have some completeness in my life. I finally understand where I came from, and I've had an opportunity to build those relationships. It's different, I guess. You're building adult relationships. You can never get back the time that you didn't spend together. You'll never get back. I'll never have grown up with my half sisters, my brother, and never get back the relationship that I missed with my mum when I was a child. But now at least we have an adult relationship and you have a chance to get to know each other, and that's been pretty amazing.
Even the way you tell it there, it's actually very emotional.
Yeah.
I think for you two beside Averil, is it?
Yeah, because I think part of the journey that people go through when they try to find out about their background, like think of any Irish conversation anywhere in the world, and it's always, what's your name, where are you from? And I think for a lot of adopted people, that sums up really, it's what's your name, what was my first name, my original name, and where was I from, and what was that about? And I know in my own case, I went over to St. Patrick's Guild, and I always remember I'd go into this room and I'd meet this nun. It was nice enough, but quite stern. And there was a little picture up on the wall, as it were, behind your head. And it was a little picture of gentle Jesus, meek and mild. And, you'd ask about stuff and you just get blank for an answer. And then there'd be a kind of a reasonableness conversation. But you're doing very well. You have your own family, you have a job and so on. But it's not to do with anything like that. It's to do with just questions about who am I, where am I from, and what's the background.
You never did meet your mother, did you?
No, I didn't. No,
explain that, because you went looking loads.
I did. I went very, very early on, but in the early days, like in the 1970s, it was a complete shutdown. And also, you came, as it were, in a background where, and it's so funny when I met people, I remember part of my journey was all over the southeast, back and forth, Carlow, Kilkenny, Wexford, and I've met, like Averil has said, fabulous people with whom I have a really good connection, who've been really nice to me. And when I first began to really make inroads in a similar process to Averil when the Adoption Society got a social worker, and I went down and met the local parish priest, and he was quite an intellectual man, and he said to me, and Pat, my husband, came with me, and the housekeeper let us in, and it was this big old parish house, and we were sitting in the parlour with a big polished table, and he was saying to me, but I've never heard of this before. And I was saying, but I know that this is the place because the Adoption Society have told me and everything. And I think he might have known that I was in politics. I wasn't sure. And he kept saying, I've never, ever heard of this before. And then he constantly talked about the price of sheep. And it was...
As you do.
As you do. And, and like going into kind of almost politician mode where if people choose to talk to you about something, you respond. And then a couple of months, he said, I'm going to try and find out. And he said, I'm going to check with a couple of people. And then the next time I met him, firstly, 2 other people had arrived looking for details because this would have been towards the end of the 1990s, and there was an opening out then, particularly because the people coming back from America. And he said the first 3 people I asked, they all said, "Did you not know?" And
meaning who your parents were.
Meaning exactly that. And then I remember somebody ringing me up, and then a lady wrote to me, a wonderful woman whom I met, called Mrs. Ryan, who was the midwife in the area, and she wrote and she said, she said, I'm sort of 75, 85 years old, but I drive my own car. I've been a midwife, and she had figured out who I was, and she had actually been there when I was born, and I went and I met her, as I met so many people in farmhouses. And what I always remember was her sons came in as well, and they'd taken off the boots and they were in the socks and they were standing, we were all in the farmhouse kitchen, myself and Pat and Mrs. Ryan and her sons, and she reached up to the top of the dresser and she took down her original records of her midwifery.
Wow.
And she was able to show me my particular name and the time of the day that I was born. And that was so fantastic. And that was, that felt just amazing for me. And then other people, somebody else rang me up who knew me in another town and said, God, there was a guy talking, in the bar last night. And he said, oh, that little girl from over the mountain who went away. Well, she's back. And there's things like that feel incredibly...
Because your mum had died, your natural mum, by the time you found her, unlike Averil, you didn't get to meet your mother. Is that a huge regret?
No, because I always think that I've been very privileged and lucky in life. I'm an optimist, and I look at all the good things. I mean, the Burtons and my mother's family, the Kings, where, in fact, there were so many resemblances as well between them and my original family in terms of kindness, in terms of things like music, that, in my head, they're almost all one, even though they don't particularly know each other at all.
And both Joan and Averil there were talking about Temple Hill, but where they were adopted from. And you have your own Temple Hill story, of course, don't you?
Well, I do. And it's funny listening to Averil's story there. Averil is probably telling the story that my daughter would tell about how, trying to find your mum. When my baby was born, she was born in St. James's Hospital, and in fact I had been born in St. Kevin's Hospital. It's the same place, but it was just renamed James's. So I always assumed, stupidly really, because looking back now I'd say, well, why did I think that I was going to bring the baby home? But I assumed during the pregnancy, and I was in the hospital for 7 days with her, that she would be coming home with me in my arms.
You were 16 at the time.
Yeah. And of course my parents knew better, because I was still a child myself. For example, when the family doctor told me I was pregnant, because I'd gone up because I thought there was something wrong, I wasn't even quite sure what did that entail. I know it sounds silly, but it is true. But anyway, so I was in the hospital for 7 days, and a neighbour of ours came in with my mother to pick me up and the baby, as I thought. And my mother said, I had the baby all dressed up and all ready to go. And my mother said, now you go down and sit in the car with our neighbour, and I'll be down in a minute. So I said, OK. And she said, no, I'll bring the baby down. And I said, that's grand. So I went down and, got into the car. And my neighbour said, put on your seatbelt, which was strange because there wasn't legislation in those days for seatbelts. So I put on my seatbelt, and next thing he put his foot on the accelerator and we zoomed out of that hospital at speed. But I could see my mother coming down. There was a ramp. It's probably all changed now. And I can still see it like it was yesterday, walking down the ramp with the baby in her arms. And I was saying, stop, And he said, no, just be quiet, be quiet. So we drove off to the adoption place. I'm not too sure where it was. And there was a nun there in her black habit. And I was hysterical. And she, more or less, her attitude was, well, you made your bed, you have to lie in it now and sign up now, and, you're not good enough to have a baby, or blah, blah, blah. So my baby, as it turns out then, I didn't realise until much longer, years later, that she was brought to Temple Hill. So we all have Temple Hill in common. And but she was there for about 3 months before she was adopted, so she wasn't there for a huge amount of time. And indeed, the family who adopted her were really lovely, lovely people. And I met her mum. I've met her mum on a number of occasions, but one of the things that strikes me, I will always remember it, is because, as a person who got pregnant and knowing that, and finding out I was adopted, but you have this stigma. I had a double stigma, one being adopted because I knew I was different, and secondly then being pregnant and having a baby, and, which was completely, because we're talking about the early 70s. But my daughter's mum said to me that she prayed for me every week, that she prayed and to thank me because I had given them the gift of a baby that she and her husband so much wanted. And for her to say that to me, it really helped me, because my loss obviously was their gain, but they brought her up, and indeed they adopted another little girl in a fabulous home, really well loved and well looked after, and still they're very, very close.
Do you remember the moment? I mean, Averil was saying earlier that it was so moving the day she got the letters, knowing her mum wanted to meet her natural mother. Do you remember the day you found out your daughter wanted to meet you? I
do, because like that, I had been living. I was married. I had 2 other children at that stage, and we were moving out to Bray, where I live. And before we left for Bray, I gave the adoption authorities my new address, and just in case my daughter ever came to look for me. So that would have been in, say, the mid-80s. And so I remember very, very clearly, I was out, actually, it was 1995, canvassing, was during the Johnny Fox had died, and it was the by-election, and we had a candidate, so I was out canvassing in the middle of the election. But like that, the letter it came to the house, and from the adoption authority saying, we have some news, please get in touch. And I knew immediately. And
I got a phone call from a cousin, a distant cousin of mine called Nan, and I was in the old Dublin County Council. So again, it was exactly around that time that Anna's talking about. It was the middle 90s. And I had got contact with my mother's cousin in America, and I had written to her, but I didn't know what to say because I didn't even know if she knew that I existed. So I had written saying I was doing some historical research into a particular woman, and I heard nothing then for a while. And then one day I got this phone call, and this woman, Nan, said, I heard you were looking, my aunt in America is called Anna May. I heard you were looking for Anna May, and what was it about? Because when she comes over here, she stays with me and stuff like that. And I said, well, I was looking for information on my mother. And I didn't say it was my mother, I said her name. And she said, I always knew you'd come back. And I've been in so many kind of farmhouses where people have sat down, hugged me, cried, and they've all said the same thing. What, and a lot of people would be conservative, very religious, all that kind of thing, but they've just said over and over again to me, we just didn't know, we didn't know what else to do, that was the done thing, nobody ever, actually maybe you did better by going away, like Anna's just said. And it was, I don't know what came over Ireland that so many children ended up being given up, but it was certainly the structure and the ethos of the country at the time.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I think at one point I was looking back on statistics on adoption when I was doing my own adoption bill last year, and at one point over 95% of children born to unmarried mothers were put up for adoption. So there was no choice whatsoever for women. There was no lone parents allowance. There were no supports. Pretty much virtually every child who was born to an unmarried mother was put up for adoption. But I think one of the cruelest parts was that silence. And I think often for a lot of people, not meaning anything bad by it, but, when I met, it was also very emotional for me when I met my aunt. And she said my aunt is my mum's older sister, she's a few years older. And she said, they didn't talk about it, and I think that was the experience of a lot of mothers. You've got pregnant, nobody in the family mentioned it, talked about it, and then you put your child up for adoption, you're supposed to kind of just go on and just act as if everything was the same. And when I met her, she was like, you've no idea how great it is for me to meet you, because you're my niece, and I've always wondered whether you were okay or not. And a lot of I get phone calls now all the time since I started talking about this. I'm sure Joan and Anne probably do as well, from other adoptees and from mothers. And again, a lot of them will say one of the hardest parts of all this story all along is the silence in Ireland, that we just don't talk about these issues, because there are 50,000 of us that are adopted. There are our mothers, our fathers, our aunts and uncles, and yet we don't have these conversations.
Do any of you, on a personal level, did any of you feel angry at any stage that you were given up for adoption?
Not at my mum, and I never, my adoptive parents, when they told me that I was adopted, they didn't know much about my mum, but they knew that she wasn't married, and I would have known enough myself to know that, look, she didn't have much choice. But I do feel when we have these conversations about mother and baby homes and that whole environment, I'm angry about the Ireland that did that to women. The Ireland that forced women to separate from their children, that maintained the silence over it, that made adopted people and mothers feel for a long time like they had something to be ashamed about and that they shouldn't talk about it. And I think we finally have answered at the start about kind of shining a light. I think we have an opportunity now to do something about that and to kind of make up for it.
Absolutely. I think just on my story, my adoption was quite different insofar as that my biological mother, she was married and she'd had 3 children, and her husband, because they were living in rural Ireland, they didn't have much money. He went across to England to work, so he used to come back and forth, but suddenly then at some stage he stopped coming back. So she met a new partner some years later and became pregnant with me. But and she couldn't afford another baby. I mean, it was a struggle enough. So her sister said, look, when the baby is born, we will take her. So that was when I found out then at 16 that I was adopted. I then realised that the mother that I thought was, Mummy, was actually my aunt. And the person that I thought was my aunt was actually my biological mother. So mine was quite different. But and apart from the adoptions that took place and the legal ones, and indeed we all know now there's so many illegal ones, there were a lot of inter-family arrangements made where, like that, a sister or a brother would take the baby, or the grandmother would. And because I know a lot of women who grew up thinking that it was the mother.
Were you shocked to discover your mother was your aunt and your aunt was your mother? I
was absolutely shocked. And, and I was saying, how did this happen? But again, we talk about the silence. Averil talks about the silence like it wasn't discussed. And indeed, after my baby was taken from me for all the right reasons from my mother's point of view, and in hindsight, she was absolutely right. I was told that day when she came back from bringing the baby to Temple Hill that we will not talk about this again. She told me, look, we've done this for you because you are still a child yourself, you're not mature enough, blah, blah, blah. And she said, but we'll not talk about it again. And we didn't talk about it again.
When you were asking about anger, I think for a lot of people, you see, the alternative to adoption was to go into an institution. And without a doubt, being in an institution or an orphanage, I mean, there's no choice. If you have a chance to give a child a home and parents and love and care, and certainly I grew up in the centre of Dublin. I would have always been aware, vaguely, not in detail, of the existence of places like Artane and particularly of Golden Bridge. Like, kids were kind of warned off. And when I was about 4.5 or 5, my legal adoption must have been going through in terms of the Burtons, and we were still living in Rialto. And I remember all the neighbours taking turns to kind of feed me because the social workers were coming. I remember the kind of social worker ladies coming and the house being scrubbed and me being fed.
The fear that you'd be taken or something.
And of course, any child being, relays of people saying, please eat. What do you think you're going to say?
Don't eat.
You don't eat. Because the absolute fear was that the child could be taken away. And you see, even when the discussion went on around the children's referendum, that was there were people with a strong residual fear that a child could be taken. And my dad, my adopted dad, Joan, his mother had died when they were very young and left 4 children. And his dad worked in the railway in Inchicore. And those 4 children had to look after each other, and their father looked after them for fear that some busybody, what they used to say, an interfering priest or nun, would come along and they would put children like that into a home.
Do you ever worry about, or did you ever worry, all of you, about upsetting your adoptive family, the family that in fact were your parents, brought you up? Were you worried about that?
Yeah, that was a huge issue for me when I didn't, well, like Anne, we didn't talk about it. I think my parents maybe just didn't know how to talk about it, or it wasn't talked about in general, so that's not unusual. But my parents told me I was adopted when I was about 10, and we never had another conversation about it. It was just never mentioned. Maybe I think they were trying to say, look, you're still our daughter, it doesn't matter, it's not a thing. It's not a big deal. But then that meant when I was looking for my mum, I didn't want to say it to them because I thought I'd be upsetting them. And when I thought, well, look, maybe nothing will come about it, why upset them unnecessarily? So I only told them then eventually after I'd made contact with my mother and was about to meet her. And I got myself in an awful lot about it. I was sick for weeks. I was pit in my stomach. I was really worried. I didn't want to hurt them. I wanted them to understand that they were still my parents, that there was a part of me that I needed to know about. So I remember I rang them and I invited them over for lunch or something in the house. And kind of immediately they were suspicious because I think I took a day off work and they were like, what's this about? And they came over and they sat down and I said, okay, look, I've something I need to tell you. And I said, look, I've been looking for my natural mum. I've made contact with her. And then my dad, my poor dad just looked at me and he said, Jesus, you're not sick. I think they had got it into their heads the few days before I had rang them and said, look, come over for lunch, I need to have a chat with you. They were thinking, God, what's going wrong? Is there something wrong? Is she ill? And he just said, God, thank God. And then my mum said, look, we always knew you'd want to. We in fact, we wondered why it took you so long. We thought you would have wanted to do this earlier. So actually I got myself into it and not about nothing. But of course I was worried about hurting them. They're still my parents, my brothers and sisters that I grew up with are my siblings. They're my family and you don't want to hurt your parents. But I think it was just, the silence of it meant that it became a bigger deal for me than it needed to be. And they've been great since then. They've been very supportive.
Loads of texts like Miriam, I'm in floods listening to these brilliant women. That's from Eileen. It's wonderful to hear their stories. But fathers haven't been mentioned. There's a couple of texts there about saying, what about your natural fathers?
Well, my adopted mother had died when I was 20. She got cancer and she was ill for a couple of years and she died. But in fact, it's always funny. she had a baby before me called Averil, not Averil. I know it's Averil. That's right. Averil saw me writing down Averil, and that she died in infancy, I think, from meningitis or something like that. And then my mother adopted me, but she actually helped a lot of other people to go out to go out to Temple Hill, because I've met people who said, "Oh, your mother was a friend of my mother, and that's how I got adopted." So there was obviously a kind of a women's circle, a women's network, and it was a woman. You were saying, was it ever discussed? Yes
or
and no.
Fathers.
Yes and no. But everybody knew about it because, for instance, occasionally if I did well in something like an exam, one of the neighbours would say really nicely, "Now, look how she did, and she's adopted." On the fathers, I think when I found my mother's family, I also found my father's family. They had been cousins, but he was dead by then as well.
Okay.
So I never met either of them.
Averil?
I haven't found my dad yet. When first I met my mum, she said to me that if I wanted to, she told me my dad's name and told me that if I wanted to find him, that she'd help me. I think at the time it was just so overwhelming meeting her and my extended family that I just emotionally kind of wasn't ready to deal with it. It's probably something that now I would like to do. I'd probably have the strength to do now, but at the time I remember I met my mum, and then it was her 50th birthday, I think, about a month later. And then I was, we had a dinner, and my aunts and uncles were there. My granny was there. My brother and sisters were there. And it was just huge for me to get to know my mum's extended family. I suppose there's just something a little bit different about your mum. I think I would like to get to know my dad. But there's just something more emotional, I think, about your mother. She's the person who carries you for 9 months of your life. I was with her for a few weeks before I was adopted. So I guess that was the bigger kind of thing was that I needed to find
But
my
is there
mum.
a possibility that he could be listening, your father? And if he was, or if he is?
If I would like to find my dad. So, yeah, if he's listening, you can get in touch.
Okay.
Sorry. It is I still find it difficult to talk about this issue, and I have spoken about it a couple of times in work, even when we're having debates, and spoke again this week on the mother and baby homes debate on that. It's just I do still get emotional when I talk about this. It's just
Perfectly normal.
it was such for a long time.
I
It
know
was just
it,
such a source of sadness and loss for me, and it's worked out great for me since, and that's fantastic. But there's still that little girl in me that gets, and I don't know how to explain that, but there's still that little girl that gets upset when I'm trying to do a rational interview. But it's so personal to me, and it's so emotional.
I find that too, because the couple of times I've spoken about it in the Dáil, I can feel all the emotion welling up inside me, and then I can feel my chin start to quiver on my lip, and I'm saying, will you stop this? Take a hold of yourself. And I'm saying, and digging the nails into my hands to stop bawling, crying, giving a speech. But I remember hearing Averil's story first when we went. A number of the women, Rockets members, and indeed the men, were invited to meet Philomena Lee last year when she was over. And Averil and myself and Gillian Van Turnout went over to meet her. And Averil sat there and told her story. Well, we all ended up bawling, crying, because we all had. I'm sure Averil probably didn't know too much about me at that stage, but we were all. And then we listened to Philomena's story as well. But I think you mentioned there about the fathers. In my own case, my biological father was the man that my birth mother met some years later, fell in love with, became pregnant, and indeed she still lived in this area, this rural Ireland, and was denounced from the altar that this married woman who was deserted and had children and now was pregnant, so that was my father. And but I mean, I don't know. I've received.
Did you ever go find him?
I did meet him, but again, we didn't speak about it. It's like that they were my aunt and uncle, so we didn't speak about
So you
it.
didn't know when you met him, you didn't know he was your father. You thought he was your uncle.
Yes, I didn't realise. But I think, and I have had some communication from men who've said that they would have liked their girlfriends, say, to have kept the babies or their whatever, but they had no say in it, and they felt very, very badly done by. But the other thing is, I think there are a lot of men out there who don't want to know, who probably knew that their girlfriend was pregnant and walked away.
Because we're coming to the end of it, Joan, or any of you, if anyone's listening now who's adopted or wants to find something, what would your advice be?
Firstly, well, there is the National Adoption Contact Preference Register. So there's a register there that adoptees can sign up on, their natural parents, other relatives. So if there's aunts, uncles, people whose brothers and sisters had children put up for adoption, they can sign up. So firstly, to do that, I think there's 10,000 people on that who haven't been matched.
Okay.
So there are a lot of people who've signed up themselves and haven't been matched on the other end. So I would encourage people in the first instance to do that.
And there are a number of organisations of adopted people who were tremendously helpful to me. And in fact, they came to me as a TD and as somebody who had been a minister, just asking me about lobbying. And eventually, after a couple of months, they were saying to me, how do you know so much about it? And I said, well, because I'm adopted myself. And then some of them said, but have you never been able to trace? And I said, no, every time I had gone to
and
the
they gave
society.
You the names of places.
And no, they actually helped me, and they just gave me tremendous confidence by just talking about it. So I'd say to somebody, maybe try and find, maybe through your adopted parents or siblings, someone else who's been adopted. Talk to them. Maybe talk also to Bernardo's. They have some confidential helplines as well.
And the Adoption Rights Alliance as well.
They have a tracing handbook on their website. If people just go onto the Adoption Rights Alliance website, they'll find a really good handbook for doing your own trace as well.
We could go on for another 2 hours. But Luca Bloom is coming back in to sing for your birthday. Okay, so we're going to take a quick break. You're going to stay with us.